Hey, somebody needs to release the anger. You have? Excellent. Good morning, afternoon, or evening. You are listening to The Professional Noticer. Hello, everyone. I'm Andy Andrews. I thank you for making me a part of your week. My purpose here today and with every show we do is to play the part of a best friend or a coach. I want to help you live the life of your wildest dreams by giving you access to the greatest mentors the world has to offer today. The Professional Noticer is sponsored this week by our buddies at Tucker ATV. You know, the variety of power sport products at Tucker ATV is extraordinary. Hustler turf equipment, the entire line of Echo power tools, and of course, Shannon and Lisa Tucker carry every make and model of Polaris ATVs. They have the big Polaris side-by-sides, even bigger Ranger crew, and you have to see the showroom. Taxidermy, antique displays, and an indoor porch with a porch swing. There's comfortable chairs, a big screen television, and free coffee. Stop in and meet Shannon and Lisa. The Tuckers treat customers like family, which is why folks from 14 states have done business with Tucker ATV. Highway 43 North in Jackson, Alabama. Tucker ATV, the small town business with the national reputation. Observations and answers. That's what we do here on the Professional Noticer. And of course, we love it when we can come to the table with observations and answers. And it's even a bonus when we get a great story in there. You know, every now and then we reach a point in society where tension seems to hang a little heavier in the air. It's not just the news, it's the tone of conversations, the frustration people carry, the sense that we've lost something we're not sure how to get back. And whether it's conflict between generations or divisions in culture, or just a weariness of all the yelling, a lot of people are wondering, where is all this headed? And more importantly, is there anything I can do about it? That's why this week I want to share something from my personal archives. It's something I recorded a few years ago, but it really seems even more relevant now than it did then. It's called Generational Anger Defused, the true story of a choice that changed everything. And in it, I tell the story of a single day that changed me. I've not shared this story anywhere else, and even now, I don't tell it lightly, but I believe this story holds a principle, an overlooked truth that can make a real difference today for all of us. So if you've ever looked around and thought, surely there has to be a better way, this story might be the answer you didn't know you were looking for. So let's go back and take another watch, take another listen. Here we are.
Lately, I've been considering the state of relationships, and not just across family lines, but business, political, and ethnic lines as well. I've been reminded about something I witnessed a number of years ago. It's a story I've never told, but I think now it's time. For me, a new, much greater awareness of a concept I'd heard of my entire life took place in July of 2005. I was asked to go to Ireland to attend a series of meetings. This was back during the days I carried a Geneva Conventions ID. This card, I was told then, was to be on my person every moment I was outside the United States, to include international airspace and foreign waters. A security clearance, it seemed, came with a few odd risks I had never considered, and one of those is being out of the country in civilian clothes while working with strange branches of our government's military or the intelligence services. I arrived in Dublin the evening before the meetings, and settling into the hotel room, turned on the television just in time to catch the news. I was transfixed by this newsreel from Belfast as I watched one of the men I had been briefed about, a man whom I would meet the next day, was repeatedly knocked off his feet by British police who were using a water cannon. The man's name was Gerry Adams. In 1948, Gerry Adams was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. He was the newest addition to a family already steeped in the 200 years of violence between Britain and Ireland. His great-grandfather participated in a dynamiting campaign of England in the 1860s and 1870s. Jerry's grandfather had joined the Irish Republican Army at age 16, and in 1942 participated in an IRA ambush on police. He was shot during the action, arrested, and sentenced to 8 years in prison. 2 of Adams' uncles were also imprisoned for IRA activities. In 1969, Northern Ireland erupted in major rioting and violence. For 2 centuries, the discord between England and Ireland had been seen as a civil rights issue. But as a new decade began to dawn, an even uglier version of what's now known as the Troubles began to emerge. The largest battles were being fought between Protestants and Catholics. Nationalism was also involved, but it seemed everyone turned to target the British troops when they arrived. Jerry Adams, now in his late teens, was in the thick of it. Atrocities raged from both sides. During a civil rights march in Derry involving thousands of people, British paratroopers shot dead 13 Roman Catholics in an action that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. A British inquiry exonerated the soldiers, suggesting the demonstrators were terrorists linked to the IRA. Decades later, the British government would concede the demonstrators were innocent. On the 21st of July, 1972, a day that is known as Bloody Friday, the IRA answered by detonating 26 bombs, killing 9 people and injuring 130. Jerry Adams, by many accounts, was rising through the ranks, finally to become commander of the Belfast IRA's 2nd Battalion. But he was making quite a name for himself, writing public letters protesting British Army harassment. Before long, the process of internment was implemented by the British government. It meant that a person could be locked up without a trial. And one of the first to be interned in March of 1972 was Jerry Adams. This move by the British government produced more violence. Adams' release from internment in June of that year was secured only after the new leadership of the 2nd Battalion made it clear that there would never be a ceasefire if he was not freed. The Belfast group was now becoming the Provisional IRA's powerhouse, and Jerry Adams was becoming the face of their movement. Upon his June release from internment, Adams moved back into leadership. It was then that the first of the disappearances also began. People were killed and secretly buried. Many such acts would follow. Prominent IRA figures Brendan Hughes and Dolores Price, both now deceased, firmly contended that Adams was the architect of the disappeared, as well as being the one who took the bombing campaign to London. At that point, Jerry Adams was on a British Army shoot-on-sight list and seemed lucky to simply be arrested, sent to prison, and released over and over again. In 1983, however, a seemingly new Jerry Adams emerged. His hair was styled, his beard trimmed, and he wore suits. In November of that year, Adams was named president of Sinn Féin, the political arm of the IRA. He was still a target, of course, and in Belfast 4 months later, March 1984, British loyalists fired 20 bullets into his car. The 3 men traveling with him were hit as well, but Adams was shot several times in the neck and shoulder. He survived. 7 months after the attempt on Adams' life, there was a much larger, heavily funded, and well-planned attempt to assassinate another public figure. But this time, it was Great Britain's Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher. 28 days before Thatcher was to host a conference in the Grand Brighton Hotel, a visitor using false identification booked into the room 1 floor above the suite, always reserved for the Prime Minister. Over the course of several days, 100 pounds of plastic explosives with a time-delayed fuse was built into the false wall of the room's closet. When the bomb detonated on October 12, 1984, Thatcher just happened to be in what was later determined the suite's only survivable location. She and her husband were unhurt, but the blast killed 5 people and severely injured 31 more. Meanwhile, Gerry Adams had begun talking peace all over the world. During the next number of years, the face of the IRA seemed to show up almost everywhere. With Ted Kennedy, with Nelson Mandela, with Bill and Hillary Clinton, with Donald Trump, with Fidel Castro, on 60 Minutes, and after a time, even Prince Charles seemed charmed. Finally, in 1998, representatives from the United States, Great Britain, the Republic of Ireland, and Northern Ireland examined a peace accord that has come to be known as the Good Friday Agreements. This treaty obviously called for the IRA to lay down their arms, but it also called for the release of IRA combatants, those still in prison for their actions during the Troubles. Nevertheless, after examination, all parties signed. Among those signatures was Bill Clinton of the United States, Tony Blair of Great Britain, Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, or President of the Republic of Ireland, and from Northern Ireland, Gerry Adams. But, as you might imagine, there are still hard feelings. So the next morning, my first meeting in Dublin was a private breakfast with 3 other men. One will remain unnamed, but besides me, the other 2 were Bertie Ahern, the Taoiseach, or President of the Republic of Ireland, and Robert Mueller. He was at that time America's Director of the FBI. While I still can't talk about the content of that conversation, it concerned moving into the larger meeting that was to follow breakfast. Remember a minute ago when I mentioned there still being hard feelings? Well, they were on full display when we moved into the primary meeting room. There were, I suppose, a few more than 50 people in attendance. Security was intense. But as the meeting kicked off, I was wishing all of the security outside the room was inside with me. Bertie Ahern talked, and people were mad. Robert Mueller talked, and people were mad. But when Gerry Adams entered the room through a back door to join the conversation, I thought the roof was going to come off. I did my job that day, which was not to enter into the discussion. I was there to watch, to notice, if you will. I was there seeking insight. It was hoped that I might bring context and perspective to a debriefing that was to be held later. Curiously, however, I noticed something no one asked me to look for. Now, understand, in these situations, I rarely watch the person speaking. I'm looking for reactions in other people. I am to interpret these tells. At one point, while people were talking or screaming at each other, someone said something about the horror of the Brighton bombing. They cursed the IRA. Someone named victims, and someone else named the man who planted the bomb. Slowly, I became aware that one of the victims, a man named Harvey Thomas, was in the room. Harvey had been Margaret Thatcher's director of communications and was buried under tons of rubble. On my row, I became aware, was a young woman named Jo Berry. Her father, a member of Parliament, had been killed by the bomb. Then my brain switched on to a strange reality, and my eyes were drawn to this unobtrusive man I'd seen slip into the room earlier. Slip, by the way, is the correct word. While others entered the room with purpose, confidence, or in conversation with someone else, this man caught my attention because it seemed as if he were wishing himself invisible. Suddenly, someone pointed at him, cursed, and screamed while he sat stone-faced. This, I realized, was Patrick McGee, the Brighton bomber. At that moment, I saw Joe Barry turn around and catch McGee's eye. It was brief, but her face showed such compassion for him that I was stunned. He saw it too and gave an almost imperceptible nod before closing his eyes. I looked toward Harvey Thomas, and while McGee did not, I saw the same kind of look radiating from Thomas that I'd seen from Joe Barry. And I suddenly had the thought, unlike all these others in here, Harvey Thomas and Joe Barry actually had something done to them, yet they seemed to be the most peaceful people in the room. How is this possible? When the meeting was over, security cleared the room quickly. Only several people were left. Bertie Ahern, Robert Mueller, and Jerry Adams had huddled. The man I considered my boss and his boss were deep in conversation. Back in a corner of the room, also allowed to stay, stood Joe Barry, Harvey Thomas, and Patrick McGee. I headed to their corner. After introducing myself and clarifying a couple of my instincts about their relationship, I showed them a small camera I had with me and asked if I might ask some questions. I sensed that what they had to say might just change my life. They agreed, and I recorded 6 minutes of video. What they related to me that day, off and on camera, did change my life because it changed my thinking. I posted it on my website years ago without comment, and that's where it just remained buried until today. Through the years, some people have found and watched it, of course, but because I have wrestled with their thoughts and words, there's been very little conversation surrounding the video. Today, after 15 years, I have more personal context, a greater understanding about what I witnessed that day. But I remain curious. Knowing what happened to Joe Barry or Harvey Thomas, and knowing that I have let much smaller things than they endured ruin huge periods of my life, can the peace they have found be as simple as choosing to think a certain way? Here's that video. After you see it, I have a few more comments, and I'll leave you to your thoughts. This is Harvey Thomas. Harvey was Director of Communications for Margaret Thatcher. This is Joe Barry. And Joe's father was killed with the Brighton bomb. Harvey was also injured in that. And this is Patrick McGee. Patrick is the man known as the Brighton bomber. And Patrick spent 14 years in prison for that. And Patrick, you were sentenced to life, is that correct?
I was sentenced to whole life, which means in effect I was never to be released.
Right, and yet, here all three of you are in one shot.
Actually friends.
Actually
Yes,
friends.
for
How
different
did this
reasons.
happen, Harvey?
Probably better to start with Joe, because Joe's story is a slightly longer one. Mine was a sudden decision, but Joe, tell a little about yours.
After the bomb went off, my life was completely changed forever. I was devastated, and I wanted somehow to end up bringing something positive from the bomb, to find a way of helping bring peace. So 2 days after the bomb went off, I made a silent prayer that I'd find a way. In '86, I did a TV program in which Harvey was in it as well, so we didn't know each other then. And in that program, I'm asked, would I ever meet the man responsible? And I said, one day, maybe I will. And that day came 4 years ago when Pat agreed to meet me. And we met in a private house in Dublin. I wanted to meet him, to hear his story and to see him as a real human being. But what surprised me from that meeting was how open Pat was to hearing my story. And that was the beginning of another long journey, which was still on. And now, 4 years on, I can say we are friends.
Pat, what did you feel when you walked into the presence of the woman who her father was killed by your actions?
When I agreed to meet Joe, I was there. I agreed to that meeting, I suppose, from a political obligation, and that is to try and explain what motivated me and people like me to become engaged in the armed conflict. The only assurance I sought beforehand was that it wouldn't be a confrontational meeting, and on that basis I agreed to the meeting. But when you sit in the same space, you share the same space with somebody you've hurt, that's an extremely intense atmosphere. And we sat and talked for 3 hours, and I suppose that process opened up something in me, that has continued to be tested and challenged, and that is the fact that I hurt human beings. I was involved in an armed struggle for a long time. I would stand over my role in that struggle, but I've become to realise that part of me closed down as a human being, that in order to be involved in conflict, to be involved in a war, you have this reduced view of people you would have called your enemy. You see only the uniform or the label, the political label attached to them, or the nationality attached to them. You don't see them as a human being.
I came at this from a totally different point of view because I was very close to the bomb.
You were under the rubble.
I was under the rubble. I went up through the roof of the hotel and crashed down. A miracle that I wasn't killed. For many years, I sort of almost looked at it objectively and not so personally. But back in 1998, I felt very clear when I was at a reconciliation conference in Louisville, Kentucky, that I had to do something about it. So I wrote to Pat and I said, Pat, as a Christian, I write and say, I forgive you. So for me, in a sense, it was a one-off, once decision 14 years after the event.
Right.
Not going through so much of the things that Jo had gone through, with her family and losing someone like that. And it was simply a decision. I said, right, I have to do that. Once I'd made that decision, then it was over for me.
One question that I feel like people would really want me to ask you, I feel that so many of us go through things that aren't nearly as dramatic as what you three have been through and what has intertwined your lives. And yet so many of us, we tend to be controlled by the bitterness and by the rage and resentment that you three seem to have resolved. What advice and maybe you were in the process of resolving, but what is it that you would say to us, who, we find our lives been out of shape by little arguments and little things?
It's a good question. I'll go for that one first. All feelings are valid, and that's one thing I've learnt. I've had a lot of feelings of pain and grief and anger, and I allow every single feeling I have. I acknowledge it, I feel it, and through feeling it, it changes and moves on. What I've learned is I have a choice of what I do with my feelings. When I feel anger, I can either use my anger to hurt others or feel my anger, and then it's transformed into something else. And what my feelings transformed into is I now call my passion for change, my passion for peace.
We've been meeting for 5 years, and it's always challenging. One of the reasons it's challenging because we disagree. We're never going to come to agreement on certain issues. For instance, the fact that I would still support the actions we took, the IRA took. we're philosophically, fundamentally at a mile apart on that. The good, though, is that we're prepared to meet and listen, try to reach an understanding, and respect the integrity of the other person's point of view. And I do. Harvey's and Joe's, I've met them over many years. We've tested our opinions on each other. I think we've got a fair idea where we're coming from.
Well, there are many, as Joe says, you're entitled to your feelings. The question is, what do you do about them? And in my case, it was a step of a Christian faith. In Joe's case, it was a search. In Pat's case, it's a realization perhaps of more of the personal touch that he said so often that you don't think about when you're considering yourself at war. But then you begin to realize afterwards the effect it has on people, and therefore that relationship changes. So it's a question of what you do, what you think, and what you believe is right.
Right. Thank you. Thank all three of you so much.
Very curious, isn't it? To see three people who still fundamentally disagree and yet are friends, actually good friends. All three are still alive, and all three still correspond quite often, occasionally eating dinner at each other's house. It's an amazing thing to think of. It's an amazing thing to understand that it is a place that we can come to. Now, I look at them, and again, I haven't had anything in my life that has been done to me as horrific as what was done to Joe Barry, her father being killed, and to Harvey. And as I watch and as I talk to them, I understand forgiveness in a way that I never have. See, I always thought forgiveness was like a knighthood, something I would bestow upon some lucky person who came crying and begging me to forgive them, that maybe I would, if I felt like it, if I thought they deserved it. But after 15 years and talking to experts and reading books, I can't find any expert or any book, including the Bible, to tell me that for one person to forgive another person, that person has to ask for it or deserve it or even know that the forgiveness has taken place. Now, I'm not talking about the forgiveness as a spiritual touchstone that many of us understand. I'm talking about, what do we have in our power? What can we do when we're laying awake at night and everybody else is asleep, but we're thinking about that guy and what he did and what we said and what we would have said if we had a minute to think about it, and what we will say tomorrow if he comes around the corner wearing that stupid purple bow tie. We'll look him right through in the face and we'll have it. And it's odd to think, sometimes we'll be like bent out of shape, and whoever it is we're mad at is across town sleeping peacefully, unaware that we're even thinking about him. You see, it turns out that forgiveness is a decision. It's not an emotion. We treat it like an emotion, which is why it drags us around like a dog on a leash sometimes. But it is a decision. We can decide to forgive. I remember as a kid hearing the story, where they asked, "Master, how many times should we forgive? 7 times? 70 times?" And he said, "No, 7 times, 70 times." And I remember as a kid hearing that story and thinking, really? Some moron is going to do something 490 times and I'm supposed to continue to forgive him? But see, I now understand that story in a different way. I understand it speaks to my weakness, not to someone else's offense. because I tend to take it back. I tend to forgive and then find myself driving down the road, 2 days later and thinking about that guy and realizing, oh yeah, I need to forgive again. And I understand now that we can make that decision. We can make that forgiveness. We can forgive and do it until it sticks within us, that it changes who we are. Because remember, we're not going to change who they are. We can forgive. We can decide to forgive even when they don't ask for forgiveness, even when they don't deserve it, and even without them knowing that we have forgiven. It turns out that forgiveness, in that sense, is for us. Now, sometimes I've talked about this, and I've had people say, oh, what, so they're just going to get away with it? Well, I don't think it's up to us to decide who gets away with anything or whether or not they get away with it. But in this case, in any instance, we're not talking about anybody getting away with anything. We're talking about forgiveness, not trust. See, forgiveness is about us. Trust is about them. Forgiveness is about the past. Forgiveness is about us not allowing our history to control our destiny. Trust is about their future and what they do. Do we forgive somebody who steals from us? Sure. Do we continue to do business with them? Probably not. Do we forgive somebody who lies to us? Yes. Do we continue to believe everything they say? No. See, forgiveness and trust are two different things. And a lack of forgiveness can be dangerous. From the Shakespeare we had to read in high school to the soap operas on television, the history of recorded humanity is very clear in one particular area. There is a terrible price to be paid by individuals and families who maintain their anger, hold on to grudges, and seek revenge. Therefore, we must become bridge builders. Let's close with a perfect description of how this can happen with words written by Gloria Gaither. Let's build a bridge where walls once stood. I'd like to reach you if I could. Stone by stone, let's make it strong. We've been apart for way too long. You build from your bank, I'll build from mine. We'll reach each other in no time. And when we do, there'll be a way to make that crossing every day.
I'm Andy Andrews, the professional noticer, harnessing common sense and wisdom to plow through challenges all the way to an answer for you. And I think that'll do it for this week. Get us out of here, Matthew. So, ladies and gentlemen, and to the boys and girls who aspire to become ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of another episode of The Professional Noticer. In a world where common sense has become a superpower, I'm harnessing that tiny bit of mental energy I have for you, seeking wisdom, making observations, and endeavoring to answer tough questions in a way that will empower your family and your business. I'm Andy Andrews. Until next week, goodbye. This episode of The Professional Noticer was produced by Matt Limpert. The Noticer theme written and performed by Sugarcane Jane. Contempt for the cast and crew provided by Twinkle and Smoke of Beverly Hills. Additional financial consideration provided by the International Ice Kicking Association. How long has curling been an Olympic event? Since God was a boy, right? Well, isn't it time another pointless traditional winter sport shared the spotlight? As you already know, ice kicking has long been played in Canadian schoolyards. At some point, kids in Minnesota, North Dakota, and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan created league play. But not until today has there been an effort to formalize rules and style of play by making ice kicking an official Olympic sport. The rules are simple. At both ends of the field are a single 50-pound, carefully stacked mound of ice cubes called ices. Each team has 8 players who defend their own ices while attempting to kick the other team's ices. Each time an opposing team's ices are successfully attacked, it's regarded as a single point. If the team on attack circles behind the opposition's heavily defended stack in order to kick ice, that is referred to as a crazy ice move. The U.S. national team, a part of the International Ice Kicking Association, is currently seeking locations for exhibition play. If you'd like to be involved, go to kickice.com and put in your subject line, "Please come kick our ices." Representatives will be in touch.